A man lay dying with a bullet lodged near his heart for close to 2 weeks. His doctors said it was medically impossible. He said goodbye to his men anyway, on his own schedule, not theirs. Daniel Day-Lewis played a version of this man and delivered one of the great performances in film history. The scene Scorsese built around his death is unforgettable. It's also set in the wrong decade entirely. The film kills its Bill the Butcher during the Civil War draft riots of 1863. The real William Poole was already dead for 8 years by then, buried before the first shots of the Civil War were even fired. Hold on to that. This isn't a case of a movie softening something brutal. It's a case of a movie borrowing a real man's name, real nickname, and real dying words, then building an entirely different story around all three. This is the story of the real William Poole, a butcher's son who built himself into the most feared street fighter in Manhattan, helped turn a mayoral election into a small war between nativists and Irish immigrants, and died in a way so slow, so strange, and so poorly resolved by the courts that it's almost unrecognizable next to the version on screen. Quick question before we start. Do you think the real Bill the Butcher was more or less frightening than the movie version? Comment your guess. The real death alone might change your answer. William Poole was born July 24th, 1821, in Sussex County, New Jersey, to English-descended working people. His father was a butcher by trade, and when William was 11, the family moved to New York City to open a shop in Washington Market, the loud, bloody, crowded wholesale meat district in what's now Tribeca. Poole learned to cut meat, and he learned it well. But the trade taught him something else that mattered more for the rest of his life: how to handle blood without flinching. By his teenage years, he was already known in the neighborhood, not for his skill at the cutting block, but for his skill in the streets. He grew into a large man for the era, well over 6 feet, well over 200 pounds, and he fought without any of the restraint bare-knuckle boxing technically implied. Newspaper accounts from the 1840s describe him gouging out an opponent's eye during a street altercation connected to a staged dogfight. This wasn't a gentleman's sport. Poole fought to permanently end an argument, not to win a match. It's worth being precise about what made him different from just another neighborhood tough. New York in the 1840s had no shortage of violent young men. What set Poole apart was scale and consistency. He wasn't a man who occasionally lost his temper. He built an entire local reputation, sustained over years, on being the person nobody in his part of the city wanted to cross, which is a very different and more calculated kind of dangerous than a hot temper. By the early 1850s, Poole led a gang called the Washington Street Gang, which grew into the much larger and more infamous Bowery Boys. He ran his operation out of a saloon he opened called the Bank Exchange, part bar, part headquarters. To understand what happened next, you have to understand New York in this exact moment. Massive waves of Irish Catholic immigrants were arriving and settling into the 5 Point slums. The Tammany Hall political machine met them at the docks, offered work and shelter, and demanded loyalty at the ballot box in return. It was a functioning, if corrupt, system. Poole hated it completely. A proud native-born Protestant, he aligned himself with the Know-Nothing movement, a nativist political faction that wanted to strip immigrants of voting rights and bar Catholics from public office. Poole and the Bowery Boys became its street muscle, terrorizing immigrants at polling places through beatings and intimidation. On the other side of this war stood John Morrissey, Irish-born, Catholic, and everything Poole despised. Morrissey had emigrated as a toddler, grown up poor working mills and iron foundries in Troy, New York, and eventually made his way into the city. By 1853, he'd beaten Yankee Sullivan to become the bare-knuckle boxing champion of America. Tammany Hall noticed and hired him as a shoulder hitter, an enforcer who used violence to protect polling stations for their candidates. It's worth sitting with how perfectly matched these two men actually were as enemies, because it explains why this rivalry escalated the way it did. Both were self-made through violence rather than birth. Both commanded genuine personal loyalty from dangerous men. Both had legitimate claims to being the single toughest fighter in New York City at the same historical moment, one representing everything the nativist movement wanted to protect, the other everything it wanted to expel. This wasn't a business dispute that turned violent. It was two men who had each built their entire identity around being unbeatable, forced to share the same small stretch of Manhattan streets. The two men's hatred came to a head during the 1854 mayoral election, when Poole and his men attacked Morrissey's crew while they guarded ballot boxes. Morrissey never forgot the beating. On July 27, 1854, he challenged Poole to a bare-knuckle fight at an Amos Street dock and walked into an ambush. Poole had stacked the crowd, and his men jumped Morrissey before the fight could even properly start. The feud escalated through early 1855 into open street violence between their respective crews, including one earlier incident where an associate of Morrissey's exchanged gunfire with one of Poole's closest allies, a prizefighter named Tom Hyer. New York's political class understood something worse was building. Nobody predicted how fast it would arrive. What's striking, reading back through the newspaper coverage of this exact stretch of weeks, is how openly the city was tracking it. This wasn't two obscure gang leaders building toward a private grudge nobody else noticed. New York's papers were covering the Poole-Morrissey feud almost the way a modern outlet might cover a public political rivalry, because in a real sense, that's exactly what it was. Immigration, religion, and machine politics, all running through two men who genuinely hated each other on a personal level as well. On the night of February 24th, 1855, Morrissey was drinking in the back room of Stanwix Hall, a saloon on Broadway near Prince Street, when he heard Poole's voice out front. Morrissey confronted him directly, and by most accounts, drew a pistol and fired 3 times at Poole's head. Every shot misfired. Poole drew his own weapon, but didn't fire. Accounts describe a bystander talking him out of shooting an effectively unarmed man. Police arrived, arrested both men, and both were released within the hour. Morrissey went home. Poole made the decision that would kill him. He went back to Stanwix Hall and stayed past midnight. Shortly after midnight, several of Morrissey's associates arrived: Louis Baker, James Turner, and Patrick McLaughlin, known as Pa Dean. Pa Dean walked up to Poole, spat in his face, and demanded to know what he was looking at. Poole, by multiple accounts, stayed remarkably calm, offering to bet he could beat any one of them in a fair fight. Nobody took him up on it. Baker shouted for the group to move in and drew a revolver. His first shot reportedly struck his own arm by accident. Accounts of exactly what happened next vary in sequence and detail, but the outcome is consistent. In the chaos, Baker fired again, and the bullet tore into Poole's body. Some sources describe the shot passing through his leg before a final shot reached his chest. Others describe a single shot to the chest directly. What every source agrees on is where that final bullet ended up, lodged in or immediately around Poole's heart. That medical distinction matters more than it might seem for understanding what happened next. A bullet that punctures the heart muscle itself is almost universally and immediately fatal. There would be no 2-week vigil, no daily newspaper bulletins, no deathbed accusations. A bullet lodged in the sac surrounding the heart, while still an extraordinarily dangerous wound by any standard, is at least medically consistent with the slow, agonizing decline rather than an instant death. The 19th century doctors treating Poole didn't have that vocabulary or that imaging technology. They just knew, correctly, that what they were watching shouldn't have been possible by the medical understanding of their own era. Poole didn't collapse immediately. By multiple accounts, he grabbed a knife and moved toward the door, before finally going down into the arms of one of his own men. The doctors who examined him afterward were genuinely stunned. A man carrying that kind of wound near his heart should not have survived the hour, let alone the following 2 weeks. For those 2 weeks, New York effectively held its breath. Crowds gathered outside his home. Newspapers printed daily updates on his condition, the way a modern outlet might cover a hospitalized public figure. He was conscious for most of it, and he used that time to publicly accuse Morrissey of ordering the hit, insisting he himself had never fired a shot that night. On March 8th, 1855, William Poole died. His final words, as reported by a journalist present, were some version of, "Goodbye, boys. I die a true American." He was 33 years old. Even the uncertainty around that exact wording tells you something true about how this story reached us. There was no audio recording, no court stenographer at his bedside, just a journalist, present or relaying secondhand information, writing down a dying man's last words for a newspaper, competing with several others to cover the same story. That's the same mechanism that shapes almost every famous last words quote from this era. Close enough to be believable, not close enough to be verified with modern certainty. 3 days later, on March 11th, Poole's funeral became one of the largest public spectacles New York had seen. His coffin was draped in an American flag. A procession of roughly 150 carriages moved through the streets, followed by an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 mourners with thousands more lining the sidewalks. He was buried at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, a native-born nativist street brawler, given a send-off that looked to onlookers closer to a fallen war hero's than a gang leader's. Scale that funeral against the New York City of 1855 for a second. This was a city of roughly 600,000 people. A procession of 5,000 to 6,000 mourners for a street gang leader, not a mayor, not a general, not a religious figure, represents a genuinely enormous slice of the population turning out, or at minimum, a political movement making very sure the world noticed that it had. Louis Baker fled New York almost immediately, boarding a ship bound for the Canary Islands. A wealthy nativist backer financed a private clipper ship to chase him down, and on April 17, 1855, Baker was intercepted at sea and dragged back to face trial. 8 men were eventually indicted in connection with Poole's killing, including Baker, and importantly, John Morrissey himself. That detail matters, because the popular version of the story often claims Morrissey simply walked away with no legal consequence at all. The documented record is more precise. He was formally indicted alongside the others. His charges were ultimately dropped specifically because he could be placed elsewhere at the moment of the actual shooting, not because nobody ever tried to hold him legally responsible. Baker's trial lasted 15 days, the jury deadlocked. He was tried a second time, hung jury again. A third time, the same result. After 3 consecutive hung juries, the charges against him were dropped entirely. The man who fired the shot that killed William Poole never spent a day in prison for it. It's worth naming exactly why juries kept deadlocking, because it reveals as much about 1850s New York as the killing itself. One documented account of the first trial describes the split running specifically along lines of nativity, jurors of foreign birth voting to acquit, others voting to convict. Whether or not that exact breakdown held for all 3 trials, the broader pattern is consistent with everything else in this story. A courtroom sitting directly on top of the same nativist-versus-immigrant fault line that had already produced the killing it was supposed to be judging. Patrick McLaughlin, Pa Dean, the man who spat in Poole's face that night, didn't get nearly as long a reprieve from violence himself. In 1858, he started a fight in a dance hall with a man named Cunningham, who drew a pistol and killed him on the spot. That jury deadlocked too, and Cunningham walked free. John Morrissey's later life reads less like a footnote and more like an entirely separate American success story. He retired from boxing, built a gambling empire, opened a casino in Saratoga Springs, and founded the Saratoga horse racing track that still operates today. He ran for Congress with Tammany's backing and won twice, then later broke with the machine entirely, testified against Boss Tweed, and won a seat in the New York State Senate before his death from pneumonia in 1878 at age 47. Sit with the shape of that outcome for a second. The man popularly blamed for ordering a rival's assassination went on to help found an institution still operating a century and a half later and to serve in the United States Congress, while the man who actually fired the fatal shot walked free from 3 separate trials. In this particular story, legal accountability and historical memory ended up pointing in almost opposite directions. Here's what's important to understand about gangs of New York specifically. It was never really presented as a direct biography of William Poole in the first place. Scorsese's film draws its title and much of its texture from Herbert Asbury's 1927 book of the same name, which devotes real attention to Poole's murder, but the film's central plot, its fictional protagonist, Amsterdam Vallon, and its climax during the 1863 draft riots are all invented, built around a character who borrows Poole's nickname, his physicality, and his famous dying words. Here's what it changed. Beyond the obvious date, the real Poole died in a chaotic, almost farcical bar altercation, a spat-upon insult, a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his own attacker's arm, a 14-day deathbed vigil covered daily in the papers, and 3 separate hung juries that let his actual killer walk completely free. None of that fits cleanly into a single climactic movie scene. The real story isn't more brutal than the film's version. It's messier, slower, and in its own way, angrier, because unlike the movie, the real story doesn't give you a clean resolution at all. That's the pattern worth sitting with here. Hollywood didn't need to invent a more frightening version of William Poole. It needed a tidier one whose death could land at the emotional climax of a different, invented story, instead of in the middle of a real, unresolved one that never actually got its justice at all. Next case file is already in the works. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.